In our last episode, we discussed the foundations of thought that drove the Enlightenment and how that Enlightenment will in turn drive these Atlantic revolutions we're talking about today. There are four key revolutions that I want to talk about: North American, the French, the Haitian, and the Latin American. Somehow, I'm going to try to do all of this in around 10 minutes. Wish me luck. We'll start with the one close to home. In the middle of the 18th century, Britain, in its quest to dominate world markets with its navy, gets into a 7-year-long scuffle with the French. This war, the creatively named 7 Years' War, is fought in North America, India, the Mediterranean, and at sea between the two major powers of Europe. Poor Spain, who was so rich last unit, has really fallen off because of massive inflation and financial mismanagement. So it goes. Britain wins, but not after completely and definitively spending too much money. To recoup some of this money and to develop better defenses of its newly established borders, it began to reevaluate its relationship with its North American colonies. Particularly in the North American colonies, this is important because the colonists very much saw themselves as subjects of the British king and citizens with British rights that were protected by Parliament. So when the British system begins to violate those rights by increasingly restricted trade through harsher mercantilist policies, through increased taxation, and through negation of colonial assemblies, it's seen as tyrannical by people who believe that British citizens have rights and who have been exposed to the growing world of the transatlantic Enlightenment. Unfortunately, their efforts at reform and redress are rebuked by the king, who maybe isn't having a good couple of years, and a national identity has to be constructed in order to get all the way to the Declaration of Independence, in which good old TJ, Thomas Jefferson, basically plagiarizes John Locke to say that people are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He goes on to say that the right to govern is born from the will of the governed, and that when the social contract has been violated, it's got to go, basically justifying the actions of the colonists for anyone who is down to make an alliance. You know most of that story already, and it's not really what our focus here is about. Rather, the focus is that ideas about natural rights, growing conversations about those rights, and a nascent nationalism give birth to what is considered by many as an inherently conservative movement. The people in high status and positions of power before the revolution remain in power after. There is no restructuring of society, and those who didn't have any rights before the revolution don't get rights after them. It does, however, lead to the first government in the world that is strictly and deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinking being put into practice, and these ideals will inspire other revolutions around the world. Next up is the French Revolution. French soldiers, freshly back from all this talk of natural rights in North America, realize that France is ruled by an inept absolute monarchy that has bankrupted the nation and literally has no idea how to fix it. The new bourgeoisie wants to know why they have all this money and know-how, pay all the taxes, but yet have no rights. So the king, King Louis XVI, calls for an old institution that hasn't seen the light of day in a long time, the Estates General. He asks them to please help him figure out what to do. The Estates General has 3 estates. The first estate, or the clergy, which shows how important the church is to France, the second estate, the nobles, and the third estate, everyone else. Turns out that the third estate pays all the taxes and has none of the benefits, so they decide that France needs a constitution and to become a constitutional monarchy. The other estates say buzz off and lock them out. So they go to a tennis court and take an oath saying that they won't leave until France has a constitution and call themselves the National Assembly. This didn't make King Louis very happy, and he threatens to imprison them all in the Bastille, where political prisoners were kept. But the citizens of Paris stormed the Bastille, kicking off the revolution, and Louis was forced to become a constitutional monarch. It's in this moment that old TJ again is helping his friend the Marquis de Lafayette pen the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which begins, "All men are born free and equal in rights." There's so much enlightenment there. Behind the people's backs, however, Louis had been plotting with his in-laws, the Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs, and when the people found this out, the revolution took a turn for the worse. Began the Reign of Terror and eventually ended with mass beheadings, war on all sides, the rise of Napoleon, and the recreation of essentially a monarchy. Whoops. While all this upheaval was happening in France, their most lucrative colony, Saint-Domingue, was feeling the aftershocks. Haiti, as it would eventually be called, was dominated by a small class of super wealthy planters, the Grands Blancs, who relied on the forced labor of some 500,000 enslaved Africans. There was a small middle class of whites, the Petits Blancs, free blacks, gens de couleur libre, and people of mixed race. But it was an extremely unequal society. During the French Revolution, everyone who is not a planter starts to really marinate on this whole everyone is born free and equal in rights thing. And what starts as a small revolt of the middle class against the planters turns into an all-out slave rebellion, which turns brutal and messy as the enslaved Africans burn the sugar plantations and take no prisoners. Not only is it particularly violent, not that the others weren't, but because Haiti is so amazingly lucrative, the French keep coming back to try and re-establish slavery and eventually capture the Haitian leader Toussaint Louverture and assassinate him, plunging Haiti into chaos, but not eventually reclaiming it. The Haitian Revolution sends shockwaves through the Atlantic world as white enslavers look nervously around, hoping that their own captives don't get the idea to rise up and follow in the footsteps of the only truly successful slave revolt and first Black-run state in the Western Hemisphere. Lastly, let's move over to Latin America. After the French Revolution and ensuing Napoleonic Wars, Europe is thrown into chaos, and that chaos extends to Spain, where the Habsburg king is overthrown by Napoleon, who then puts his brother on the throne, as you do. While this is happening, the Latin Americans, who, if you'll remember, have a very strict racial social hierarchy, decide that since it's really confusing who even rules them, they should probably just revolt. The revolution is driven by the Creoles, or people of Spanish descent who were born in the Americas. The Creoles, many of whom are highly educated and extremely wealthy from their plantations and exports, were sick of being treated like second-class citizens compared to the Peninsulares, and sick of Spain's backward economic policies. Led by a Creole named Simon Bolivar, the Latin Americans fight the longest and most violent of the revolutions, eventually winning their independence from Spain. Unfortunately, Latin America was deeply divided racially and socially, leaving Bolivar's dream of a united Gran Colombia to crumble after his death. The Enlightenment ideals that had suffused his seminal Jamaica letter, in which he argued that Britain should aid the Latin Americans in their fight against Spain because of a shared value system based on natural rights, disappeared into division, civil war, and strongman politics. In order to stimulate some unity in all of these places that were primed for revolution, the ideology of nationalism had to come into play. In Britain's North American colonies, a sense of colonial unity and identity as separate from Britain was needed, and in some places, it was actually difficult to develop. In France, the sense of French identity was strengthened through the Revolution and ensuing Napoleonic Wars, and can be illustrated by the tricolore and the national anthem, the Marseillaise. As the Prussian and Austrian armies closed in on the newly born French Republic, the armies of the French sang out, "Sacred love of the fatherland, lead, support our avenging arms. Liberty, cherish liberty, fight with thy defenders. Under our flags may victory hurry to thy manly accents, so that thy expiring enemies see thy triumph and our glory." In Latin America, Bolivar worked tirelessly to bridge the divide across racial and class lines that had developed in the colonies. He sought to convince Latin Americans that regardless of their station or their color, they were Americanos, together in their love of their land. He promised to abolish slavery, he didn't, and to work for all Latin Americans. It was, unfortunately, a short-lived unity. Nationalism would go on to spur unification in Germany, Italy, and the devolution of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, but these would all happen towards the end of the 19th century rather than at its beginning. Even so, it's a powerful force, sometimes for the benefit of man and sometimes to our detriment. Thanks for watching.